You are joining us today for Historical Trauma in California, and this presentation will outline how unresolved historical trauma has impacted all aspects of life and directly shapes today's socio-political landscape and Californians' overall well-being. We'll make connections between America's history and the current mental health crisis, social determinants of health, and the disparities and inequities present in California's communities today. Our discussion this morning will include the treatment of Indigenous Americans, African Americans, Asian and Pacific Islanders and Latino Americans, immigration, racial discrimination, mass incarceration, and labor exploitation. And one thing that I do actually want to add here is you'll notice that the title that we gave this was Historical Trauma in California. And one thing I loved is that when Ingrid sent us her final presentation that she's going to be giving you this morning, the title had evolved to Healing Historical Trauma in California. And so I think that the focus here is on both taking a dive into what we're talking about when we're talking about historical trauma, but then also looking at healing from that trauma is a really good perspective, and I want to highlight that. So as I mentioned, our presenter today is Ingrid Cochran, and if you go to the next slide, we have a little bit of an overview about Ingrid. Ingrid is a child abuse survivor who knows firsthand how impactful trauma and toxic stress can be for children and families. She's dedicated her professional life to investigating and educating the public about the link between early trauma, early adversity, adverse child experiences, or ACEs, and possible negative outcomes across the lifespan. Ms. Cochran's experience includes juvenile justice, family counseling, early childhood education, professional development, and community education. She's an adjunct professor specializing in Black psychology, developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, and personality theory at Tennessee State University. Her research areas are African American parenting styles, ACEs, historical trauma and intergenerational transmission, collective trauma, brain development, developmental psychology, and epigenetics. So very wide-ranging expertise. Ingrid is also the CEO of PACES Connection, which is a social network dedicated to raising awareness of adverse childhood experiences. In addition, she's an advisor on the Vanderbilt Institute for Clinical and Translational Research's Community Engaged Research Core Advisory Council and Pathways to Resilience Expert Advisory Committee. Ingrid's an active volunteer and change agent in her home of Nashville, Tennessee. She serves in leadership roles for various community-based organizations. Ingrid, we are very happy to have you sharing your expertise with us this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me in the invitation to come and talk about this important topic for the state of California. I'm very excited. I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer before we move forward. This discussion is going to center race, and I always want to do my due diligence and ensure that this discussion is about education, what the science says, what history says. It is not meant to offend, but this is a controversial topic. So I want to challenge everyone to ask questions, to feel safe to ask questions in this space. And again, this is meant to educate, not to offend. And so kind of like what Dana said, yes, we are going to examine historical trauma, the ways in which people have been dehumanized throughout history within the state, but also we want to look at what it means to heal. And so I will be utilizing a framework from the Rise Center, which is out of Richmond, California, to highlight what healing looks like as well. As we go through this discussion, one of the things that I've learned in kind of this national view is that California is extremely diverse. I am in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've presented historical trauma all across the country. And so I want to be clear that as we go through this conversation, I'm going to focus mostly on Latino, Hispanic communities, African Americans, and Indigenous peoples. But that does not mean that those are the only groups who experience historical trauma. Really, the focus on those groups is due to the amount and severity of trauma that these three groups have experienced. And it is a reflection, their treatment is deeply reflected in policies and clearly outlined in history. So that will be kind of the primary focus as we move forward. I want to highlight very quickly that when we are talking about social determinants of health, which is kind of buzzy in today's world around how we see the disparities within populations in the US, I always like to make it very clear that the dual impact of institutional racism and the ramifications of historical trauma are the reasons or the core issues that drive social determinants of health today. And so we are all pretty familiar with the ACEs study, but when I was first introduced to this study back in 2010 in grad school, it was very impactful to me because it helped me to understand the work that I was doing with juvenile offenders. I found that in my work with juvenile offenders, I was overwhelmingly surprised how many, at least in my home state of Tennessee, were Black youth. And as I went into the field of psychology and really was focused on prevention, I began to, unfortunately, just a reflection of my kind of racist worldview, I began to look into parenting practices because I believed that parenting was the primary issue when it came to juvenile offenders. I, at that time, was obviously unaware of my own bias and unaware of the systemic impact that we are experiencing in this country. And so I start with ACEs because it is definitely a cornerstone, but I feel as though ACEs are extremely parent focused and parent blaming when we really need to look at systems that impact parents and influence their parenting decisions and parenting practices. And so here are the kind of the initial 10 experiences outlined in the first ACEs study. And as we experience kind of this group of research that comes from that initial study, we find that there are other adversities within our society that are just as impactful as those 10, if not more so. And one of those you see is cultural trauma. We also see racism. And so we're going to talk more about the impact of those today. I always like to level set in our conversation around race. I want to be clear of how we got here as believing that there's such a thing as race, or what I call scientific racism. The origins of our classifications of race come from European academic elites who determined that there was a pecking order when it came to classification of people. In the 1700s, they deemed that Africans and indigenous people were considered savages, that they did not have civilization, they did not have religion and things of that nature. And then they embedded those types of ideologies within textbooks that were taught in medical schools, taught in colleges. And this scientific racism still lingers here with us in America. We believe as a society that we are fundamentally different based on skin color, eye color, hair texture, and things of this nature. And this is not true. Race is more so a social and political construct than it is genetic. And this has led to what we would determine to be racism, especially institutional racism, where because of that early classification, we have different rules and policies and ways of interacting with each other based on race, essentially a caste system that has been created based on the believed inferiority of some groups and the believed superiority of others. This has led to obviously social and political and economic advantage. And so obviously these structures have created what we would call racial trauma, the emotional injury that comes with discrimination, racism, and the oppression that goes along with people being classified based on their skin color. The impact of racial trauma is the same as any other type of trauma, meaning there's the physical impact, headaches, insomnia, hypervigilance, increase in stress-related diseases. And so race-based traumatic stress is due to living within a racist system. When we look at race-based trauma, we have several different ways that this manifests. Obviously, the direct traumatic stressors will be a reflection of individual and interpersonal interactions. So racial slurs, discrimination at work, discrimination in housing, physical attacks. These are, even though they tend to be rare, these are very impactful and again, have the same impact as other types of trauma. And then we have vicarious traumatic stressors. These type of stressors are secondary in nature and are more widespread, more common. Obviously, I've been doing presentations around historical trauma since about 2016, but I will say in 2020, with both COVID and kind of the racial reckoning, it has allowed for people to have a better understanding or better grasp of collectively traumatic experiences and also vicarious trauma. And so the video of George Floyd's death is an example of a vicarious traumatic stressor. So everyone has been impacted by this video. It's very widespread. Most people have seen it. I have not. But I will say that when we have vicarious traumatic stressors, they are driven by identity. For example, with George Floyd's video, everyone was impacted. However, Black people had more of an impact because they identified with his race. Also, Black men had more of an impact because they identified with his race and gender identity. And so vicarious stressors are very much tied to higher rates of issues around mental health, homicide, suicidality, and other issues that impact kind of the community level and society level. So increase in community violence, increase in mental health issues that we would consider to be kind of the impact that would go along with seeing something that was traumatic or stressful. And so these vicarious traumatic stressors when it comes to racial trauma are more likely to occur in African American communities and Latino communities. When we look at what we'll be talking about today, historical trauma, this is considered a transmitted stressor. This means that there has been a collectively traumatic experience that was so huge in magnitude and so impactful that it is then passed on through generations, and it impacts all aspects of a culture. For example, if we use chattel slavery of Africans, we will find that chattel slavery has impacted the parenting practices of the descendants of African slaves. It has impacted food. It has impacted music. It has impacted personal romantic relationships. All aspects of African American culture have been impacted by chattel slavery. This is, again, a sustained, collectively traumatic experience that then creates a vulnerability within a specific group of people. And that vulnerability is not just limited to culture, it is also impactful to one's physical body. It alters DNA. It increases likelihood of stress-related diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, and other types of heart disease. And then, of course, it comes with a stigma that is tied to that group of people throughout society. So it makes them more likely to experience discrimination and oppression even after that collectively traumatic experience has passed. And so we are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences study. This has allowed us to see that adversity in childhood has impact on our genetic materials. It also has impact on our environment and can lead to intergenerational transmission through environmental factors like parenting, like community issues. And so we're going to talk today about the kind of epigenetic mechanisms and also intergenerational transmission. So the Rise Center out of Richmond does a great job of furthering our understanding of historical trauma through the use of two different frameworks. First, they've extended the original ACEs pyramid to include historical trauma and local context. And they've also modified Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model, which we'll get to in just one moment. And so here, as you can see, the extended pyramid includes intergenerational and historical trauma, specifically for Black people and Indigenous people. It also outlines nation building and white terror as the basis of what we would consider to be complex trauma that we see today in communities of color. And so they also have extended this to include social context. And I'll give an example here. In Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, there's an area known as North Nashville, area code, zip code 37208. It has one of the highest rates of incarceration in the country. And we see the impact of that in social determinants of health in the area. If I drive just 7 minutes to the other side of town, there's a nice affluent area called Green Hills. When we look at the outcomes, specifically health outcomes for both of those areas, the life expectancy in North Nashville is 69 years. The life expectancy in Green Hills is 81. And so we're talking about the same city, very close, just separated by 3 to 4 miles. And yet there's a huge gap in life expectancy because of historical trauma. So even within one city, where you are born determines your, or is closely related to your life expectancy, the schools that you will be interacting with, the type of healthcare you will receive, and can impact your overall quality of life. And so this is what that green area is when it says social context, social and local context. Another thing to consider when it comes to this visual is that as we move up and we get to the area that we first see on the typical pyramid that we use for ACEs, that it includes complex trauma. This means that an individual has 3 or more ACEs. What we know from the research is that as we get to 4 ACEs, there's a particular steep impact when it comes to poor quality of life and stress-related diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. We also see social identity threat. This means that in various ways, we see that there is a very clear tie between how people are treated in society based on their skin color. This social identity threat manifests in many ways. It could be media assaults, so the stereotypical caricatures of people of color in the media. It could be the erasure, so that when you go to school, you only have books that have white or Eurocentric characters and things of that nature. But these social identity threats, micro and macroaggressions, complex trauma and a higher likelihood of encountering trauma because of your skin color or historically traumatic background is further outlined in this visual. As we move up a little higher, I want to highlight in that next area, that's kind of beige brown area, that allostatic load is there. This is where we have higher rates of stress for people of color and people living in poverty. These higher rates of stress cause what we call weathering. This is allostatic load, or weathering is where we have damage to our physical bodies, damage to our DNA, that leads to cognitive issues, poor mental health and cognitive health, and definitely impact to our physical health with those stress-related diseases. Obviously, from what we know from the original one, we have disrupted neural development. And as we move even further up, I like that the RISE Center, where it has the adoption of health risk behaviors in the initial pyramid, the RISE Center discusses coping, because it is very important to point out that as people experience oppression, as they experience discrimination, as they experience poverty, that they will engage in coping strategies. This is adaptive and normal human behavior. And so the first pyramid has the adoption of health risk behaviors, but I want to be clear that we're talking about coping strategies that are being used. As we move further up, we see, disability, disease, social problems set in, and ultimately early death. I appreciate that the RISE Center at that peak where it has the blue peak where it has early death, the RISE Center talks about quality of life. Often when we talk about these deficit types of research, we talk about issues around education or even say things like early death and impact to life expectancy. But I would like for us to think a little bit about the impact of quality of life, that there is, as we are all born into this space, that because some of us have darker skin, we're not living in the same way that others are living. And this is very important. Quality of life should not be left out of this conversation. And so that peak, early death, and then of course, quality of life loss for BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color. This visual helps us to have a better understanding than the original pyramid, where the original pyramid starts at conception. What the RISE Center infographic is saying is that even before you are born, before you are conceived, the experiences of your ancestors will increase or decrease your likelihood of experiencing trauma in your lifetime. Historical trauma starts with collective trauma. A collective trauma, at this point, we are all pretty familiar with collective trauma because we have just come out of one. COVID, the pandemic is considered a collectively traumatic experience. Collectively traumatic experiences are unique in that they involve large groups of people. They shatter our collective sense of safety. And this then leads to a host of impact across our larger society. So much so that when we think about collectively traumatic experiences, we often think of the world in the space of pre the collectively traumatic experience and post the collectively traumatic experience. We think about that with COVID. We think about that with 9/11. And so these experiences are so impactful that they change the way that we view ourselves, the way that we view the world, and they have great impact on our larger society. Collective traumas do not occur within a vacuum. They are largely impacted, or they have reciprocal interactions with the larger society and are viewed within the wider social political context. So, for example, COVID happened during an election year, thus it became a political football. Even though you would think that a respiratory virus couldn't become a political issue. It did because of the timing. This is the case with, like I said before, during the 16 and 1700s, there was a great deal of exploration across the world. The classification of Indigenous and Africans as savage and uncivilized coincided with land theft and enslavement. And so as we dehumanize a group, it then makes it easier for us to create policies and ensure that we have poor treatment of those groups based on these classifications. And so again, collective trauma happens within the wider social political context. We have both primary and secondary impact. We can use COVID as an example. If we can remember, in 2020, everyone was impacted when it came to COVID, not in the same way. Some people experienced the disease themselves. Some people had people pass away. Obviously, this is primary impact. Some people weren't able to work in the same way, or their children weren't able to go to school. This would be secondary impact. And so this impact across the board is what collectively traumatic experiences, this is what makes them unique. Everyone has impact, even if it's not the same, there is some impact. And so those who go through a collectively traumatic experience, especially if they are lacking in the process of meaning making, this collectively traumatic experience can impact identity. It can lead to insufficient coping mechanisms and ultimately lead to a difficult psychological legacy. Meaning making process is important. This is one of the ways that we can heal when it comes to collective trauma. I'll give an example for COVID. I hate to be political, but I don't mind it. So with COVID, and in the past where we've had these large scale collectively traumatic experiences, we have to have leaders within our space to help the masses to make meaning. Without leaders in space to make meaning, then we are left to divide, and we will often fall into disarray in our society. Collectively traumatic experiences often lead to civil unrest without strong leadership. And so you can think about this even with children that you're working with and families that you're working with, that there needs to be some facilitation of the meaning-making process. I've gone through a traumatic experience. What does this mean? How do I make meaning of this? How do I get from this traumatic experience to post-traumatic growth? You do this through meaning-making. When we have collectively traumatic experiences, especially if we do not have a sufficient meaning-making process, this is when we get into the space of transgenerational trauma or intergenerational transmission of trauma. We first learned about this from an academic standpoint in the 60s with research on Holocaust survivors and their children. This early research on Holocaust survivors found that children who had not gone through the Holocaust themselves still had PTSD-like symptoms, and they were also able to self-report that their parents were obviously damaged and preoccupied and emotionally limited. This research was groundbreaking, but let's be clear that this was done in the 60s. Obviously, when we look at the genocide of Indigenous peoples and the enslavement and genocide of Africans brought over to the country during the slave trade, that we have clear evidence that trauma can be passed on through generations. So in my research, I found that there are pretty much 4 mechanisms by which this happens. First is maladaptive coping strategies. We have terms of maladaptive, adaptive coping strategies. I want to be clear that coping is coping is coping. It may not work long-term. It may be health damaging. It may only work for the short term, but coping is normal human behavior. All of us do it. And so As we engage in maladaptive coping strategies, obviously, the first that come to mind would be substances, alcohol, but there's also other maladaptive coping strategies that are extremely harmful within families, like isolation, emotional numbing, and things of that nature. As we engage in maladaptive coping strategies, especially as adults, we model our behavior to children around us. This is social learning theory. So children learn through their environment and the behaviors of the adults in their space. These behaviors are then mimicked by these children and can lead to a host of issues like community violence, mental health issues. Then we have genetics, which I'll talk a little bit more as we move forward, but there's clear evidence that trauma and adversity have an impact on our genetic material, and that could be passed along through generations. But I think the most impactful mechanism is survival-based parenting practices. And I always like to give the example of African-American parents because this is how I came into the understanding of historical trauma. Again, I was working with juvenile offenders. The group of children that I was working with were between ages 12 to 18. They had all committed either 3 felonies, rape, or murder. And I was very kind of morbidly interested in how they got to the point at such a young age to have such criminal histories. And so I went into my graduate studies focusing on African-American parenting practices. And this is where I learned about historical trauma. But clearly we can see how damaging parenting practices can be when it comes to a host of issues. One of the things that comes up is obviously spanking and physical punishment. But I want to be clear that in my research, I looked into the parenting practices of African mothers during slavery and Jim Crow era. What type of parenting practices do you think would need to be employed when your child's behavior could be a means of life or death? I would have to be extremely strict. I would have to be extremely physical. And so parenting practices are extremely likely to be transferred through generations. So you parent the way that you were parented. Survival-based parenting practices, as parents experienced slavery, Jim Crow, genocide, as parents were separated from children through with the purpose of assimilation with the Indian boarding schools, or separated from children through slavery. This created parenting practices that were largely driven by survival, and also strategies to ensure survival for those parents when they spoke with their children about how they should be acting based on their skin color, what was for them based on their skin color. And so survival-based parenting practice is probably the most impactful mechanism through which intergenerational trauma is passed. When we look at genetics, we have very clear evidence of the shortening of telomeres and the overall degradation of DNA. This has been highly correlated with several chronic diseases, as well as cognitive impairment and mental health issues, to include the lowering of IQ. And so when we look at all 4 of these mechanisms, we can see how this ties to the overall impact that groups that have experienced historical trauma, how that manifests in the world. And so this term itself, historical trauma, was first coined by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. It is defined as a multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural group. Dr. Braveheart also defines it as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, and that it is accompanied by historically unresolved grief. And when we look at California specifically, we have to think through the many manifestations Obviously, slavery is one, but California is greatly impacted by colonialism. So there's missionization, there's land theft, there is genocide. There's also been segregation and forced assimilation. There has even been materialistic control through the use of the police. There have been very clear history of labeling Indigenous as deviant and inferior. And this has led to a host of social determinants of health disparities within the state. And so I talked already about boarding schools, the use of police for militaristic control. Obviously, this is a component that leads to mass incarceration. I also want to highlight the suppression of language, the suppression of culture, the suppression of religion, and then, of course, the threat of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. This is rife within California's history, and this has targeted very specific groups, again, African Americans and descendants of slaves, Indigenous peoples, and the Latino Hispanic communities in California. These types of assaults often go with emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. This has been seen, especially with the Indian boarding schools, where children were subjected to physical abuse and sexual abuse within those schools, as well as forced assimilation. This has also been seen with during the formulation of the state, as well as through the Jim Crow period. There was plenty of incidents of abuse and even murders that were there was no kind of retribution for these if against people of color. This leads to a host of systemic issues that cause disparity that we still see today. And so as we think about ACEs, we need to think through another ACE, which would be atrocious cultural experiences, again, leading to a difficult psychological legacy. In the past, we have wholeheartedly, as a society, embraced this idea of scientific racism with the belief that the impact of these past experiences is really cultural differences. And so I want us to think through together, when we talk about these cultural differences, are we really highlighting that, the massive trauma that these groups have experienced is being seen as cultural differences as opposed to the impact of widespread traumatic symptoms on a collective scale. And this is important to consider because it is often talked about. I can remember even recently, I was watching the news and one of the newscasters was talking about Black youth and said the words culture of criminality. And this is, something to think about. Are we, as we look at groups who've experienced historical trauma, are we seeing these issues as cultural differences versus the symptoms of mass trauma? And so let's look at what these traumatic experiences, what they result as in our society. These events are pretty singular, but I will be very clear, this is not an exhaustive list. But historically traumatic events are listed here. I would like to point out, obviously, genocide and chattel slavery. But I also want to look at some of the others that are maybe not as what you would think as a historically traumatic event. We have mass and school shootings, assassinations and high-profile deaths, natural disasters and pandemics, large-scale economic downturns. This is a good time to kind of use the chat to think about an historically traumatic event that's still relevant to your family today. You can drop it in the chat. For example, for me, obviously chattel slavery is still impactful to my family today. As you look at this list, you may find some that are extremely relevant to you, but also there's some that are not on the list. This is not an exhaustive list. So think through, what are some historically traumatic events that still impact your family today? I see them coming in. Sylvia, I really appreciate displacement. We rarely talk about that. We're definitely still dealing with COVID and what that looks like. John, I appreciate redlining. It's deportation, yes. And so these widespread historically traumatic events really have impact. They still resonate with us. They still have impact on us, especially if we have close relationships with our grandparents or great-grandparents. They may have very close relationship with the traumatic event that impacted the way they raised your parents, and so forth and so on. Yeah, thank you guys so much for sharing those events in the chat. And so let's look at what it looks like when we have these types of events and their impact, what it looks like when it comes to our larger society. So the groups that are most impacted, and this slide gets me in trouble every time I do this presentation. I want to give a disclaimer that this is not an exhaustive list. I'm not saying that other groups have not experienced historical trauma. What I am saying is that when we look at vulnerability and impact, these groups have experienced the most impact. Impact looks like economic instability, obviously disease, poor health outcomes, and lower life expectancy. And then other social issues like a higher likelihood of experiencing suicidality, homicide, and community violence. I have Latino and Muslim Americans with an asterisk. I want to be clear why that asterisk is there. Often, when it comes to outcomes, these two groups tend to have better outcomes than Indigenous and African Americans. And I want to be very clear as to why. They tend to have stronger family dynamics, and they tend to also have a very clear tie to their history and heritage and language. These are protective factors. And so Indigenous and African Americans tend to have been severed from their traditional practices, stripped, and are more likely to be forced into assimilation. And these groups, Latino and Muslim Americans, still experience oppression and discrimination, however, have the buffer of strong family ties and strong ties to their traditional beliefs and practices. And so these are the symptoms. This is what it looks like in your work and in real life. It's a vulnerability to stress disorders. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to point out some that I think are especially important. It has higher crime and incarceration rates. It's important to control that narrative, because again, that's kind of, this cultural issue. People often will say, crime is a cultural issue. It is not. It is a manifestation of trauma at the individual level, but also at the group level, communal level, and societal level. Two here that I want to be sure to point out: lower IQ. This is a very controversial one, because this is often used as a weapon against people of color in many ways, because on standardized testing and on IQ testing, there's a gap between people of color and their white counterparts. And I want to be very clear that issues around IQ are largely due to that epigenetic impact and environmental issues. And so when we're talking about historical trauma, is not about race. Historical trauma is not about skin color. Historical trauma is about environments that are created for people. And any group of people that is subjected to poor environments will have these types of symptoms. And then also want to talk about relationship difficulties. Trauma has an impact on relationships. If we look at divorce rates and domestic violence or interpersonal violence within different groups, we will see that there's disparity based on race. This is probably one of the most impactful symptoms because our healing happens within relationship. And if our trauma impacts us and our ability to connect and form and maintain relationships, then we're more likely to fall into that intergenerational transmission. Poor relationships, less likely to experience marriage, less likely to have long-term relationships, less likely to maintain friendships. Poor relationships with coworkers and other people that you encounter, not just friendships and romance, but also just in general. And so this hopefully helps us to have a bigger, broader view of trauma, not just at the individual level, but at the community level, at the societal level. And Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological model is a great tool for that. This is a resource for you to have. It looks at both what dehumanization looks like. This is also from the Rise Center. And then it also looks at what healing and liberation could look like. So I'm not going to go through this, but you will receive this. It's a great way to also know where you are in this structure. So individual, this is teachers, counselors, people that are working with people one-on-one, social workers. Community and place, these are school districts, community centers, and then systems and institutions. These are people who work in policies. These are people who work for government agencies. And then the larger one is history, legacy, and structure. This is everyone. And this is where we have, our history of enslavement, genocide, colonization, economic exploitation, the extraction of resources, white supremacy, the patriarchy. These are the beliefs and values that fuel the oppression and dehumanization that we experience in our larger society. And then on the collective liberation side, we see what needs to be done to counteract this. We have truth and reconciliation, which is something that I'm engaging in today. We have reparations, land back, redistribution, open borders, no borders, multiracial solidarity, gender justice, and just transitions. And so you'll receive this visual in the slides that I'll provide. And so next we can look at kind of the timeline in California specifically. And we'll go through this. You'll also receive this as well. But this timeline is of institutional racism. It is focused on anti-Black discrimination, anti-Blackness. But at each one of these, we can look at California and know what's going on in this space. So 1619 to 1865 is the time where we have chattel slavery. The Reconstruction, 1865 to 1890. We will talk through what that looked like in California, the Jim Crow era, and then especially when it comes to the war on drugs in present day, there's a great impact when it comes to California specifically there. When we look at slavery, 1619 to 1865, often California is seen as a free state, mainly because it is one of the later states to join the Union. But as you can see here with the statistics that go along with slavery, this is a focus on African slaves during this time. But when we look at California specifically, we have, the early European settlers were Spanish. There were Spanish explorers, missionaries, and soldiers. missionization began in the 1760s, again with this assimilation based in religion, the stripping of indigenous practices through religion. We have the Mexican-American War in 1846, and this is where we begin to move into California as a state. After the Mexican-American War, we have the gold rush. During this time, we have what we kind of see as the California genocide. As we enter California statehood, there is kind of a wholesale genocide against indigenous peoples as white settlers come in from the East. Again, we typically know California as a free state. However, there were approximately 90,000 indigenous slaves during this time. They were enslaved by the Spanish. This is what we call de facto slavery. And then we still had some African slaves within California, even though it was considered illegal. California became a state in 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act in California made it so that both free and fugitive slaves in California were sent back, even if they were free people. They were still sent back because in the South, it would be difficult to prove that you were a free man. So anytime that they would have Black people in the state that were especially thriving or bringing in a great deal of money, they would be kidnapped and sent back to the South, even if they were free. And definitely those who were fugitive slaves would be sent back. And again, this was especially if they were prosperous, if they were making money. Many of the Black people who worked during the gold rush and on the railroads were often not paid. And so they were essentially slaves during that time as well. We also have the Bloody Island Massacre of 1850. This was against the Pomo peoples, where you have approximately 200 enslaved Pomos killed by the US cavalry and white mob because they had kind of, after an uprising where they had killed their captors. Though of those 200, they were mostly women and children. The first governor of California, Peter Burnett, came from a slave-owning family, and even in his opening address, made it very clear that he wanted the extinction or dispelling all indigenous and Black peoples in California. This was something that went on through that entire time period and became even more contentious after slavery ended, as we have the beginnings of kind of the migration of Black peoples out of the South. People tend to think that Black people after slavery had a better time of it. That's not the case. After slavery ended, there was a period after where there was starvation, intense labor still continued, and labor for Black people still went unpaid through sharecropping and other ways. So, and then we have kind of the what we call the Black Holocaust, which is the beginnings of murder, rape, lynchings, arson, or what we call domestic terrorism towards Black people in California. This was no different. This was already going on in California, but this was largely focused on Latino and the Chinese specifically. California as a state has a great deal of strife around labor. And so as people were brought in for cheap or free labor, white laborers were very resentful, and there was a lot of mob behavior towards these immigrants. And so as we have the railroad construction, we bring in many Asian migrant workers. We also have Latino migrant workers during this time, and there are several race riots and mob type behavior during this time. Two that were the most prominent were the LA Chinatown massacre of 1871, and then the San Francisco riot of 1877. Both were due to labor tensions. The Chinese Exclusion Act was instated in 1882, which prohibited legal immigration. I want to be very clear, illegal immigration was still happening, but this prohibited legal immigration and also blocked current immigrants who were already in the state from achieving citizenship. Obviously, this is a form of discrimination that was sanctioned through the state and through the larger federal government. When we look at the big picture at the federal level, we have the 13th Amendment, typically, ending slavery with the exception of those who are who have committed or been charged with crimes. This led to the beginning of mass incarceration. We tend to think of mass incarceration as a more modern issue, but mass incarceration started the year after slavery ended. And it included and was most impactful towards African Americans and, again, Latino and Hispanic communities. When we look at education, we tend to think of the segregation of education as a issue of Black and white, but this was also the case for Latino and Hispanic communities. They were also segregated in education. We need to be very clear that when we think about Jim Crow, we tend to think about the South, but there was definitely segregation, racial segregation in California. It overwhelmingly impacted Latino populations. There are plenty of whites only signs in California that are explicitly stating that they did not want to serve Chinese, Latino, and Black patrons. We tend to think of California as not being a place where there were many lynchings, but this is not the case. There were, between 1850 and 1935, there were estimated to be around 350 known racially motivated lynchings in California. Victims were mostly Latino and Asian. Victims included both men and women. And here we have one of the most notable Mexican woman by the name of Juanita, and her name is a bit of a controversy. They don't know exactly what her name was, but Juanita is kind of a name that's been given to her. And so 350 is a large number when it comes to lynchings in the state. There are a few states that got to this number when it came to lynchings in America. There was plenty of propaganda against Indigenous peoples during this time period. We have the Immigration Act of 1917, where there was a very big push to prevent Latino migrant workers from prospering. This was also the case for Chinese as well. But when it comes to like the propaganda, it was mostly against Mexicans. There was a great deal of labor tensions during this time period. There were a great deal of murders and lynchings against Latino workers, again, mainly driven by racial tensions around labor disputes and also racial tensions when it came to pay. The purpose of bringing in migrant workers was to have the ability to pay people less, to devalue people in their labor. And this led to resentment between white laborers and laborers of color. There were several political drivers to poor racial outcomes, so disparity. One of those is the New Deal in 1933 with Franklin D. Roosevelt. The majority, 98% of home loans that were given out during the New Deal went to white applicants. It also began the process of suburbanization, which led to the the construction of highways that greatly impacted Black neighborhoods. When we look at this time period for California specifically, there was very clear impact first through Japanese internment during this time. This raised racial tensions between, raised racial tensions for Japanese Americans. And there was a very clear impact from pushes against around this time from the Chicano movement and also the Black Power movement. So there were some wins. So we also have, equal rights being achieved during this time, as we have Mendez versus Westminster, which led to the desegregation of schools. Right at the end of this time period, we have the Watts race riot. This was triggered by police brutality. During this time, I talked before about how California has a very clear history of using the police as a means of racial oppression. This was one of the main drivers of the Chicano movement and the Black Power movement, is the military use of the police against communities of color, driven largely by police brutality and police murders. And so the detention by the time we get to the 60s is high. And the Watts race riot was sparked by an incident of police brutality. It lasted 5 days. It left 34 dead and resulted in about $40 million in damages. It was also used as a political, for political positioning for Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty. He pointed to the race riot in Watts and said, well, poverty is the root cause of this type of behavior. So we need to do more to ensure that people aren't living in poverty. The Jim Crow period ended in 1965 with the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act that was signed into place. And then we immediately move into the war on drugs. This time period is extremely relevant to California, as there is a very clear mass incarceration issue in California, especially back then. It has alleviated today, but it's still one of the higher rates in the country. And so as we move into the war on drugs, and the crack epidemic, we have a burst in mass incarceration, mainly targeting African American and Latino communities. These communities were over-policed. And what we know today is that Richard Nixon made several changes in the laws that really targeted Black people and Vietnam War protesters specifically. And this led to higher incarceration rates amongst those groups. One area during this time period is the beating of Rodney King. This, along with the murder of Latasha Harlins, led to the LA riots. King's beating was an example of police brutality. However, it was one of the first to ever be caught on film. And kind of the modern version, well, the modern day issue that we have now, where we have people being able to capture police incidents of violence on film and leading to more accountability. This is one of the first of those incidents. However, when between the killing of Latasha Harlins and the people who were responsible for King's death, King's beating not being charged, it led to the LA riots in 1992. That lasted for about 5 or 6 days, left 63 dead, and was responsible for over $1 billion in damages. And so California, when it comes to mass incarceration during this time period and still today, there's huge disparity, especially when it comes to anti-Blackness within the state, with Black residents only making up about 5% of the population, but still accounting for 28% in prisons and 28% in jail population. When you look at the state overall, you will see that mass incarceration is a kind of a statewide issue. It is in most areas, not just concentrated in one area. It is across the board, a statewide issue. And then present day, even though California is one of the healthier states, the disparities are still there when it comes to many issues, especially with African Americans, with highlighting heart disease, diabetes, stroke, maternal issues, cancer, and homicide. Let's see. So if we look at the main drivers, we have a list here of the main drivers of poor race relations in California. These are also intersections of where those different social determinants of health happen. So housing, policing, wage theft, and immigration are the most consistent drivers of poor outcomes in the state. And this really outlines like economic disparity, which is vast in California, especially impacting Indigenous peoples, African Americans, and Latino communities. And so I've included some solutions in your slide deck. These are largely focused on ensuring that we are engaging in trauma-informed practices. And they highlight the areas in which the Rise Center has highlighted when it comes to collective liberation and healing. And so this is included in your packet, and I want to give some space for any questions as we move forward. Let's see. Dana, I don't know if we have any questions in the chat, but we can definitely give people room to ask questions. They can raise their hand, they can come off mute.
Do not see any in the chat yet, but we'll give it just a minute. Do feel free to put your question in the chat or raise a hand if you have a question. Yes, we will drop the slides again as we go into this next section, and there will be a follow-up email at the end of the training with everything you're seeing today. Thanks for asking. All right, Ingrid, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay. So the Rise Center really outlines each level of what can be done in your particular work. And so I'm going to go back to the individual level. So listening and validating the experiences of people of color, and being able to allow people to process and integrate their traumatic experiences, engaging in family healing. So not being individually focused, but making sure that we are family focused in our interventions, in our work, tailored supports and opportunities so that there is no one size fits all in the work that we do. We have to be mindful of historically traumatic past, and we need to be able to tailor supports. And then probably the hardest one is loving connection. As we, talk about race and racism and bias, it is very difficult to change people's hearts and minds. Our country is really embedded in this biased way of looking at race. It is so pervasive that we have come kind of nose blind to it. And so establishing loving connection, especially in these politically polarized times, is probably the most difficult, having one-on-one interactions based in love. And when it comes to the community level, we have to engage in radical inquiry. This means that children should know, especially children, should know what systems are impacting their lives, what policies are impacting their lives, how racism is impacting their lives. This allows for them to look at their neighborhood and not internalize conditions or believe that people with their same skin color, that their skin color is the issue, but that it's racism that is the issue and how it manifests in our society, so that they can develop in a way that allows them to maintain a positive racial identity, which is linked to much better outcomes across the lifespan. Popular education and culture building. This is something that California does well, but how are we telling the history of everyone's history? How are we making sure that people are connected to their own traditional beliefs? Celebration and affirmation of groups, creating healing spaces and ensuring that we have space for arts and expression, and then base and power building. And then at the institutional level, this means that we are incorporating healing-centered and restorative practices, that we are ensuring that all voices are heard, that we're engaging in collective care, that we're being adaptive, responsive, and proximate, and that we're engaging in power sharing. So people having a seat at the table. And then lastly, at the history, legacy, and structure space, this is when we are engaging in truth and reconciliation. This is when we have a very clear telling of history. This also means that we are prepared to engage in reparations in a real way. Of course, land back as we think about resources and other, obviously land, but other resources that have been taken and that needs to be redistributed across groups, and then multiracial solidarity. And
Ingrid,
so, oh yes.
sorry, we have a quick question. Can you
Yeah.
give examples of restorative practices?
Yes. So when it comes to restorative practices, this is the use of conflict resolution, and also a non-punitive way of interacting when it comes to any type of discipline that's focused on youth and families. This can be used in many spaces. So it can be used in schools. It can be used in workplaces. So if we think about trauma-informed workplaces where we are not being punitive, we are giving people space to make amends, to engage in conflict resolution. Restorative practices is really meant to be a community practice when there is some type of conflict or wrongdoing that allows for both parties to be treated as human beings. I hope I'm answering that question fully, but it really is something that can be used in any setting that allows for restitution without being dehumanizing or punitive.
And then we have a follow-up question. Can you explain what base building is?
Base building. Yes. So this is when we are ensuring that people who are typically underserved are able to amass political and other types of power. If we think about this in a school setting, this is ensuring that children can create councils, that you have student ambassadors, that in every setting where decisions are being made, those who are being impacted by the decision are present. This means that you may have to go into neighborhoods and canvass, ask what their what they would like to see in their neighborhoods, what they would like to see in their schools, they would like to see in their communities, and then make sure that they have representation within all decision-making arenas. So like politics, this process it helps to level the playing field with groups who are disenfranchised and are less likely to engage in community and political spaces. A perfect example of this is the Chicano movement and the Black Power movement, where they mobilized communities to ensure that their voices were heard in political spaces. And then we have positive childhood experiences. If you're not familiar, we tend to be very familiar with ACEs, but Dr. Christina Bethel has also engaged in research that shows that positive childhood experiences have positive impact on development, and she's outlined 7 experiences that have been found to have great impact. This, to me, can become an equity issue. One of the things that we see is, yes, people of color are more likely to experience adversity or ACEs, but also we find that children of color are less likely to experience PCEs or positive childhood experiences. And so how do we ensure that children of color are able to have positive childhood experiences, which has been found to act as a buffer, and is probably even more impactful to lifelong well-being than ACEs is. So if you have positive childhood experiences, that can be a buffer against adversity. But also, if you don't have adversity, but you don't have any positive childhood experiences, you are still more likely to have poor outcomes across the lifespan. The absence of positive childhood experiences is negatively impactful. And then, of course, we want to engage in trauma-informed practices. When we look at SAMHSA's principles, hopefully today has been a grounding in the cultural, historical, and gender issues, number 6. We often leave it out when we're going through the process of becoming trauma-informed as institutions. But in order to have empowerment, voice, and choice, we have to have a clear understanding of cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so as we go through the processes of being trauma-informed or becoming trauma-informed, we need to ensure that we are highlighting number 6 of those principles, and ensuring that we are aware, culturally responsive, and we're aware of historical trauma. So I'm gonna stop there so that I want to give room just in case we have any other questions. And then, we get to have a little connection, look each other in the face. If you want to turn your camera on, and give some space for any other questions that may come up. You can raise your hand or come off mute if you'd like. Any questions or any comments, takeaways from this discussion? Yes, so I actually, this is a presentation I've been doing since probably 2016. I actually have done this for every state and region of America, to include the islands and the territories of the United States. I am a researcher and historian, so I do this for any area that reach out and ask me to. And in the past, at Pace's Connection, we had historical trauma in America series where we went through each area. And so, each region is different. California is very different from, let's say, West Virginia or Tennessee. So each state, each region has very specific issues that lead to the current disparities that we see in present day. And so California you know, again, coming in at the time that it hasn't always been a free state, hasn't had kind of institutional slavery. But when we look back at the treatment of Indigenous peoples and the labor issues, we can see today why we have such issues around economic instability with Indigenous and Latino communities, because there's been very clear effort to ensure that they did not prosper and did not make as much money and did not, they were, brought in for cheaper free labor, but not embraced in the community. And so this is obviously exploitation and wage theft. And what this means is that if we wanted to make amends, right, then that would mean that the Latino community is owed, trillions with a T for wage theft. What does it mean to make amends for that? The history of the state allows you to see how you can reverse engineer and make things right, and what that looks like. People often talk about how California is a free state and that, anti-Blackness is not so much a thing, but that's not true. California has a very small African American population because they went through clear efforts to ensure that African Americans did not come and settle. So when we went through, mass exodus out of the South, Black people attempted to settle in the West and the Midwest. And now when we look at, the numbers, there are very few people, Black people in the West and the Midwest, because they went through extreme measures and encountered extreme violence to prevent them from settling there. And so it's, it's good to be aware of the history so that you understand what that really means. So yes, there's not very many Black people in California because people didn't want Black people in California. And there were policies put in place and other means, things that weren't as formally documented, like bounty hunters and militias, to ensure that Black people didn't settle here. And so, and yes, redlining is a very clear strategy to prevent Black and Latino people from being able to prosper and gain generational wealth. And again, not just by chance, but by clear effort when it came to policy and strategies, both documented and formal and informal. And so this means that today, there's a clear evidence of how this works. California wasn't able, like other states, to put things in place to ensure kind of this elimination of Black people, like the South was able to do. But in order to compensate for that, they used the police as a means to get this accomplished. So then we have high rates of police brutality in California as compared to other places, because they went through a process to militarize the police and ensure that the police was kind of the arm of the state to keep those communities in check, to over police them, and to use them for free labor after slavery ended. And this is consistent with the history, and we have documentation of that. And so I hope that this, and I want to give space if there's any other questions before we close. We're right at time. And so I'll give it over to Dana to close us out. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. I first want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I do want to encourage you, Ingrid has shared her expertise with us today, but as she mentioned, we've shared the slides with you. We're going to share them again with you in the follow-up email. And there's a lot of additional information in those slides. We will also take a number of the links that you'll see in the slides and sort of break those out for you so you can do a little bit more homework, share them with your teams. And then the recording will also be available. And Ingrid, I want to thank you for joining us today and really pulling together a lot of different themes here in terms of the history and the importance of looking at it from a trauma lens, and then really tying that back to what we can do from a strategy standpoint, both personally and organizationally. Um, so again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that we will see you again soon at another Caltrin training. Do not leave without clicking on that survey link that is in the chat now. The certificate will be at the end, and we really value your feedback. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day and a great weekend.